sky has always held secrets. But the secrets we're about to explore don't exist in the stars above. They exist beneath our feet, woven into the very ground where civilizations rose and fell across thousands of years. Something connected them. Something ancient peoples understood with absolute certainty. Something that guided their greatest architects, priests, and city planners. Yet today, we've forgotten it almost entirely. In 1921, a man named Alfred Watkins was riding his horse through the English countryside when he noticed something that would obsess him for the rest of his life. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply traveling through familiar terrain near his home in Herefordshire. But as he gazed across the landscape at the ancient landmarks scattered throughout the region, old stone markers, burial mounds, hilltop monuments, something clicked. These weren't random. They couldn't be random. They formed lines, perfectly straight lines. Not approximate alignments or loose patterns that might be explained by coincidence. These were precise, geometric alignments that connected sacred sites across vast distances. When Watkins returned home and pulled out his maps, he began tracing these lines methodically. What he discovered terrified and fascinated him in equal measure. The lines didn't just connect a few sites, they connected hundreds of them, thousands actually, once he began to see the pattern clearly. He called them ley lines. The name came from an Old English word meaning clearing, or field, a straightforward term for something that was anything but straightforward. Over the next 20 years, Watkins documented his findings with meticulous care, photographing sites, mapping alignments, and publishing his research in a book called The Old Straight Track. He presented evidence that seemed overwhelming, measured carefully, organized logically, impossible to dismiss as coincidence. But the academic world did dismiss it, almost unanimously. His colleagues ridiculed him. Professional journals rejected his papers. Universities ignored his work. The scientific establishment had decided, apparently without serious investigation, that Watkins was either delusional or engaged in a form of intellectual sleight of hand, seeing patterns that didn't actually exist. By the time Watkins died in 1935, his life's work had been marginalized, filed away in the dusty archives of discredited ideas. Yet, something peculiar happened in the decades that followed. Other researchers, working independently and often without access to Watkins' original work, began noticing the same patterns. Different countries, different continents. The same precise alignments kept appearing. Sites that shouldn't connect were connecting. Ancient cities positioned in ways that made no sense if you believed ancient peoples were primitive and unsophisticated, but made perfect sense if they possessed knowledge we've lost. What was this knowledge? Where did it come from? And most importantly, what does it mean that we've forgotten it so completely? To understand why Alfred Watkins's work was rejected so thoroughly, you have to understand what the academic world of the early 20th century believed about ancient people. The prevailing narrative was simple and unwavering. Ancient civilizations were primitive, limited in scope, limited in understanding. Capable of impressive physical achievements through sheer labor and stubbornness, perhaps, but certainly not possessed of sophisticated scientific or mathematical knowledge. The idea that ancient peoples might have possessed surveying techniques precise enough to align monuments across miles of terrain was considered laughable. The notion that they might have organized coordinated building campaigns across entire regions struck scholars as absurd. And the suggestion that different civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, might have aligned their most important sites according to the same geometric principles, seemed like pure fantasy. Watkins, however, had something the dismissive academics didn't have: evidence. Not vague speculation or mystical claims, but careful documentation. He had measured the alignments himself. He had photographed the sites. He had mapped them with precision that, even by modern standards, was remarkably accurate. He had notes, records, a methodology. Yet none of it mattered because his conclusions contradicted the established framework of understanding. This was the real puzzle of the academic response. Watkins wasn't asking anyone to accept anything supernatural or mystical. He wasn't claiming ancient peoples possessed powers beyond human capability. He was simply observing that monuments aligned in straight lines and proposing that this alignment was deliberate. That's not a radical claim. That's basic observation. Yet, it threatened something fundamental about how the academic world understood history. The rejection of Watkins' work tells us something important about how knowledge systems operate. Evidence alone isn't enough to challenge established paradigms. You need institutional support. You need colleagues willing to seriously consider your work. You need academic journals willing to publish it. You need universities willing to research it. When all of these reject you simultaneously, even correct observations can be buried for decades. What's remarkable is that Watkins never wavered. Despite the ridicule, despite the rejection, despite watching his life's work be systematically dismissed, he continued investigating. He traveled. He measured. He documented. He corresponded with the few researchers brave enough to take him seriously. He died believing in his observations, even if he died knowing the world wasn't ready to accept them. But history has a way of validating those who were dismissed too quickly. In the decades following Watkins' death, researchers began applying modern technology to his claims. They used GPS. They used satellite imagery. They used computers to analyze patterns that would have taken a human a lifetime to verify manually. And what they found was striking. Watkins was more accurate than anyone had imagined. His observations held up under scrutiny. His measurements were sound. His fundamental claim that ancient sites aligned in straight lines was demonstrably true. Yet the larger questions remained unanswered. Why had ancient peoples done this? What did it mean? When researchers finally began taking Watkins seriously and applying modern technology to his observations, something unexpected happened. The pattern didn't stay isolated to England. It didn't remain a curious British phenomenon that might be explained away by local cultural practices or the particular geology of the Herefordshire region. Instead, the pattern began appearing everywhere. In South America, researchers noticed that the famous Nazca lines, those massive geoglyphs etched into the Peruvian desert, didn't exist in isolation. They aligned with distant mountain peaks in ways that suggested sophisticated surveying knowledge. But more than that, the lines seemed to follow geometric principles that matched patterns researchers were observing in completely different parts of the world. In Egypt, the pyramids weren't just monuments. They were positioned with astronomical precision that required understanding celestial mechanics. The Great Pyramid of Khufu aligns to within a fraction of a degree to true north. Not magnetic north, which changes over time. True north. How ancient peoples determined this without modern instruments remains genuinely unexplained. In Mesoamerica, the Mayan temples followed patterns that aligned with Venus, with specific stars, with astronomical events that wouldn't repeat for thousands of years. The precision of these alignments exceeds what observation-based astronomy should have allowed. Yet the Mayan people, without telescopes or computational devices, somehow aligned their most sacred structures to celestial bodies with accuracy that modern astronomers still struggle to match. In Southeast Asia, Buddhist temples demonstrated the same geometric proportions repeated across different regions, as if operating from a shared blueprint. In China, temples built according to feng shui principles showed alignments that correlated with ley line intersections, identified through completely independent research methods. What makes this pattern so difficult to dismiss is its consistency. These aren't vague approximations or loose similarities that could be explained by shared cultural values or similar climate zones. These are precise, measurable, geometric alignments that repeat across continents. GPS technology has confirmed that sites separated by thousands of miles align to within fractions of a degree. That level of precision doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't result from coincidence or shared mythology. Consider what this means. Cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years of history had no known contact with one another. The Egyptians didn't communicate with the Mesoamericans. The Mayans didn't trade with the builders of Angkor Wat. The Aboriginal Australians were isolated from most of the world. Yet somehow, these cultures independently arrived at nearly identical principles about how to position their most important sites. They chose locations according to similar geometric logic. They aligned their structures to celestial bodies using remarkably consistent mathematical ratios. There are only three possible explanations for this convergence. First, These civilizations all maintained hidden contact, a vast network of communication that left no archaeological traces but somehow coordinated building practices across continents. Second, these alignment patterns are meaningless coincidence, that precise, repeated alignments across different continents happened purely by chance, a statistical improbability so staggering it borders on impossibility. Third, ancient peoples were responding to something real, something in the earth itself, or the sky itself, that any civilization intelligent enough to observe could perceive, something that guided their location selection. The first explanation requires accepting a conspiracy of ancient contact for which we have no evidence. The second requires accepting coincidence so unlikely that probability becomes meaningless. That leaves the third possibility. Ancient peoples understood something about Earth's geometry or natural forces that we've lost. They perceived patterns we can measure today, but struggle to understand. What were these patterns? What drew ancient peoples to specific locations with such consistency that their choices created alignments visible across continents? The answer isn't simple. It might not be singular. But the evidence that something guided their decisions, that something coordinated their choices, grows stronger the more thoroughly we investigate. The mystery begins to transform from, "Did this happen?" to a much more profound question. What did they understand that we've forgotten? The conventional narrative about ancient civilizations relies on a comfortable assumption. People got smarter over time. Our ancestors were primitive, limited in understanding, capable of impressive physical feats, but lacking the intellectual sophistication we possess today. This story is reassuring. It confirms our sense of progress. It validates the modern world as an improvement over what came before. Except, the evidence increasingly suggests this story is incomplete. Consider Angkor Wat in Cambodia. This temple complex wasn't built randomly or according to local aesthetic preferences. It was positioned with astronomical precision that requires knowledge of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete. The builders understood a celestial cycle so gradual, so vast, that observing it would require continuous record-keeping across thousands of years. How did ancient peoples know about precession? Our culture didn't formally recognize it until the astronomer Hipparchus documented it in the 2nd century BCE. Yet the architectural alignments at Angkor Wat suggest the builders understood this concept centuries earlier. Or consider Petra in Jordan. The Nabateans built this city at an intersection of crucial trade routes, yes. But the placement also reflects sophisticated understanding of hydrology and geology. Underground water sources converge at this location, converge in ways that could only be identified through systematic mapping of the region. The Nabateans didn't stumble upon Petra. They found it because they were looking for it. They understood where water would be available in one of Earth's harshest environments. The Aboriginal Australians maintained something called songlines, oral maps of stunning complexity that allowed navigation across thousands of miles of featureless desert. A person trained in these songs could travel across terrain with virtually no visual landmarks and arrive at distant locations with precision. The songlines encoded geographical information with an efficiency that modern mapping struggled to match until recently. This wasn't primitive navigation. This was sophisticated information storage and retrieval. Yet, modern archaeology has spent centuries insisting that ancient peoples were simpler than us, less intelligent, less capable of abstract thought, less able to organize large-scale projects. This narrative persists despite mounting evidence to the contrary. It persists because accepting the evidence requires acknowledging that we've lost knowledge, that we're not simply smarter versions of less intelligent ancestors, that we're actually more limited in some ways. The knowledge that ancient peoples possessed wasn't technological in the modern sense. They didn't have computers or satellites or digital tools. But they had something different. They had accumulated understanding about how Earth worked, how to read natural signs, how to organize information and transmit it across generations. They understood principles about geometry, astronomy, hydrology, and geography that we're only now beginning to recognize and formalize through modern science. What's striking is how this knowledge manifested in their architecture. Their most important buildings weren't positioned randomly or according to purely aesthetic or defensive criteria. They were positioned according to principles we're struggling to fully articulate. When we finally measure these buildings with modern precision and analyze the patterns, we discover alignments so consistent, so deliberate, that they can only be the result of intentional knowledge. The question becomes simple. What knowledge did they possess? And more importantly, how did they possess it? If ancient peoples deliberately positioned their most important structures according to specific geometric and astronomical principles, they must have had methods for identifying these locations. They must have had techniques for measuring distance and direction. They must have had ways of coordinating large-scale projects across regions or even continents. The question is, what were these methods? The evidence suggests that many ancient cultures maintained specialized groups of individuals, knowledge keepers, who trained extensively in practical sciences. In Egypt, these were called the stretchers of the cord, harpodonaptae in Greek. Their role was to maintain geometric accuracy during construction. This wasn't a casual responsibility. It was a formalized position, a recognized expertise that societies valued enough to support. The existence of these specialists indicates that geometric knowledge was systematic, organized, and passed down through careful training. In Mesoamerica, the Mayan priesthood possessed mathematical knowledge that enabled them to predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy. They didn't possess this knowledge incidentally or through lucky observation. They maintained it systematically, recorded it in codes, and passed it through generations of trained individuals. The Dresden Codex, one of the few surviving Mayan texts, contains Venus cycle calculations accurate to within hours across thousands of years. This level of precision doesn't result from casual stargazing. It results from organized, systematic observation maintained by specialists who understood mathematics. These knowledge keepers didn't simply observe and record. They actively used their understanding to guide decision-making about where settlements should be established and how sacred structures should be oriented. They employed principles we might recognize today as applied geometry and environmental analysis. They read landscapes, identifying locations with specific characteristics, convergences of water, unusual magnetic properties, alignment with celestial phenomena, positioning relative to geographical features. The Inca demonstrated remarkable ability to integrate their architecture into landscapes in ways that enhance structural integrity while maintaining harmony with local geography. When they built mountain terraces or positioned temples, they didn't fight against the natural environment. They worked with it, incorporating natural features into their designs. This reflected accumulated knowledge about materials, gravity, water flow, and stress distribution. It wasn't accidental. It reflected understanding. Sacred geometry appears across ancient cultures in remarkably consistent forms. The golden ratio appears in Egyptian temples, in Mesoamerican pyramids, in Buddhist structures across Asia. The pentagram and pentagon appear in temples separated by continents. Spiral patterns repeat in architecture from different eras and regions. These aren't coincidental similarities. These are applications of mathematical principles that ancient peoples recognized as functionally and aesthetically superior. They used them repeatedly because they worked. What's particularly striking is how these geometric principles correlate with natural patterns. The golden ratio appears in plant growth, in animal proportions, in the structure of shells and galaxies. Ancient peoples didn't invent this ratio. They observed it in nature and incorporated it into their designs. They were reading nature's own mathematics and applying it to their architecture. The methods these ancient peoples employed weren't mystical. They were practical applications of careful observation. Astronomical observations sustained over generations, hydrological analysis, geological understanding, geometric mathematics. These were tools of a sophisticated science, a science organized differently from our own, expressed through different frameworks, but scientific nonetheless. Their monuments represented the physical manifestation of their knowledge. The alignments, the proportions, the positioning, these encoded information about what they understood and valued. The monuments were their way of preserving knowledge in physical form, making it permanent, ensuring it would survive the loss of written records or the death of oral traditions. Throughout ancient civilizations, we find evidence of a distinct class, dedicated to maintaining knowledge that other people didn't possess. These weren't rulers interested in conquest. They weren't merchants focused on trade. They were specialists in esoteric understanding individuals, trained from childhood to preserve and transmit specific technical knowledge. Their role was arguably more important than any king or general, yet history has largely forgotten them. In ancient Egypt, the priesthood of Heliopolis maintained astronomical records spanning centuries. These weren't casual observations. They were systematic, organized, recorded, and carefully preserved across generations, despite the vicissitudes of political upheaval and cultural change. The priests possessed an understanding of celestial mechanics that enabled them to predict phenomena like lunar eclipses and to recognize long-term patterns in planetary motion. This knowledge was guarded. It was considered sacred not in a supernatural sense, but in the sense of being precious, important, worthy of protection. The Vedic scholars of ancient India composed texts describing astronomical concepts, including the precession of the equinoxes, thousands of years before Western science formally recognized these phenomena. The Surya Siddhanta, an ancient Indian astronomical text, describes precession with accuracy that still astounds modern astronomers. How could ancient scholars possess this knowledge without telescopes or computational technology? The answer lies in something simple. They observed the sky carefully across multiple generations, maintained detailed records, and passed understanding down through carefully trained students. They understood that human lifespans are short, but human tradition can be long. They organized knowledge transmission as a formal system. In Mesoamerica, the Mayan priests performed calculations involving the Venus cycle, eclipse prediction, and astronomical patterns that demonstrate mathematical sophistication, rivaling modern capabilities. Not modern astronomical knowledge, they didn't know what we know about the physical universe, but computational sophistication, mathematical precision, the ability to recognize patterns in astronomical phenomena and predict future occurrences. These priesthoods served multiple functions simultaneously. They maintained astronomical records that enabled prediction of celestial events. They identified locations where natural phenomena, unusual water sources, magnetic anomalies, geological features occurred, and marked these locations with monuments. They coordinated the construction of temples and structures, ensuring geometric precision and astronomical alignment. They served as repositories of practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, engineering, and environmental management. They were scientists, engineers, project managers, and knowledge preservers all at once. The concept of knowledge guilds helps explain how such expertise was maintained. Societies organized around the transmission of specific technical knowledge, where information was carefully guarded, systematically taught to selected apprentices, and maintained through generations. Initiation rites served educational functions, formal training systems that ensured only properly prepared individuals had access to sensitive knowledge. The mysteries weren't supernatural secrets, but practical information that required years of study to fully understand and apply. This organizational structure solved a crucial problem. How do you preserve knowledge across generations when records can be lost, destroyed, or become incomprehensible? You build preservation into your culture itself. You create institutions dedicated specifically to knowledge transmission. You make the knowledge sacred, not religiously sacred in a supernatural sense, but socially sacred in the sense of being deeply valued and carefully protected. You ensure that each generation trains the next, that knowledge flows from master to apprentice, that the continuity is maintained even as individual people die. What's remarkable is how effective this system was. Information encoded in architectural alignments lasted thousands of years. Knowledge embedded in mythology and ritual survived even when the explicit understanding of the underlying principles was forgotten. The monuments themselves became records, physical storage of information that could be read by those trained to interpret them. This organizational framework reconciles an apparent contradiction in our understanding of ancient civilizations. They weren't technologically primitive, yet they operated according to principles completely different from ours. They weren't less intelligent, yet their knowledge expressed itself through different domains and different frameworks. They were focused differently. They valued different types of information. They organized expertise according to different principles. The priesthood of precision represented the intellectual heart of ancient civilization, not the kings or warriors who commanded attention through power and conquest. not the merchants who moved goods and accumulated wealth, but the quiet specialists who maintained understanding, preserved knowledge, and ensured that each generation inherited the wisdom of those who came before. When these knowledge systems collapsed, when priesthoods were destroyed, when records were lost, when the continuous chain of teacher-to-student transmission was broken, the knowledge didn't simply disappear, it fragmented. Parts survived in myth, parts survived in architectural design, parts survived in cultural practices and traditions whose original meanings were forgotten, but the coherent system was gone. When you look carefully at nature, you begin to notice something remarkable. Patterns repeat, proportions recur. Mathematical relationships appear in contexts separated by vast scales and domains. A spiral galaxy contains the same mathematical spiral found in a nautilus shell. The branching pattern of a tree mirrors the branching pattern of blood vessels in a human body. The proportions of a human face correlate with mathematical ratios that appear in temple architecture from different continents. These aren't coincidences. They're manifestations of fundamental principles about how structures form, how growth organizes itself, how efficiency and beauty often emerge from the same underlying mathematics. Ancient peoples, through observation, identified these patterns and incorporated them into their architecture. They recognized that certain proportions appeared repeatedly in nature, and they understood, even without formal mathematical language, that these proportions possessed something: functionality, resonance, aesthetic power, structural integrity, perhaps all of these simultaneously. The golden ratio, approximately 1.618, appears in the spiral arrangement of seeds in sunflowers. It appears in the proportions of human bodies. It appears in Egyptian temple design and Mesoamerican pyramid construction. The Fibonacci sequence, a mathematical pattern where each number is the sum of the two preceding numbers, governs the arrangement of leaves around a stem, the spiraling of shells, the distribution of branches on a tree. When you apply this sequence to architecture through geometric design, it produces structures that possess a particular quality, something we recognize as beautiful or harmonious, even if we can't always articulate why. The pentagram and pentagon, shapes appearing in temples across cultures, possess specific mathematical properties that affect how sound resonates and how light distributes. They're not arbitrary choices. They're solutions to specific acoustic and optical problems. Build a room with proportions based on sacred geometry, and it will demonstrate superior acoustical properties compared to a room with random proportions. The shapes and proportions aren't mystical. They're practical applications of mathematical principles. What ancient peoples apparently understood through patient observation, we're only beginning to formalize through modern physics and mathematics. They recognized that nature organizes itself according to mathematical logic. They recognized that certain proportions and patterns appeared repeatedly because they represented efficient solutions to fundamental problems of structure and growth. They incorporated this understanding into their architecture, creating buildings that functioned well, lasted long, and possessed aesthetic qualities we still recognize as beautiful millennia later. Sacred geometry isn't mysticism. It's applied mathematics grounded in observation of nature. Ancient peoples read nature's mathematical language and incorporated it into their designs. They understood, through accumulated experience if not formal theory, that buildings designed according to geometric principles derived from natural patterns performed better than those designed randomly. The positioning of temples according to these principles wasn't merely about beauty or spiritual significance. It served practical purposes. A temple oriented to cardinal directions benefits from superior solar heating and cooling efficiency. Structures built at locations corresponding to geometric ratios minimize stress on foundations and increase structural longevity. Sites positioned at intersections of natural water flow patterns enjoy reliable water sources. What appears as mystical knowledge, the sacred positioning of temples, might simply represent accumulated practical wisdom about where and how to build for optimal results. This hypothesis suggests that ancient peoples engaged in what we might call empirical metaphysics. They observed that certain locations, certain orientations, and certain proportions seemed to work better than others. They developed mythological and spiritual frameworks to transmit this practical knowledge to future generations. The myths weren't inaccurate attempts to explain how things worked. They were memory systems for preserving technical knowledge in forms that could be reliably transmitted, even if the underlying reasons were forgotten. Beneath our feet lies a system of stunning complexity. Earth possesses a magnetic field generated by molten iron moving through the planet's outer core. This field isn't uniform. It varies in intensity across different regions. It has patterns and anomalies. In certain locations, it behaves unexpectedly. In other places, it demonstrates unusual characteristics. Modern science has confirmed what ancient peoples might have sensed through careful observation. Earth's magnetic field is geographically variable. Magnetic declination, the difference between true north and magnetic north, varies by location and changes over time. Navigate by a compass in one location, and you'll be pointing to a slightly different direction than navigating by the same compass in a region hundreds of miles away. These variations are measurable, predictable, and consistent. They result from how Earth's magnetic field interacts with the planet's surface. Geomagnetic anomalies, regions where the magnetic field behaves differently than expected, occur worldwide. Modern geophysicists have mapped these anomalies. They exist. They're real. They correlate with specific geological features and mineral deposits. Something remarkable happens when researchers investigate whether ley line locations correspond with areas of geomagnetic anomaly. They often do. Not universally, not without exception, but often enough that the correlation appears intentional rather than coincidental. Sites that ancient peoples marked as sacred, locations where they positioned temples, areas where they built their most important monuments. These frequently sit atop regions where Earth's magnetic field exhibits unusual properties. Why would ancient peoples deliberately seek locations with geomagnetic anomalies? Several mechanisms might explain this. Magnetic anomalies might have affected animal migration patterns or plant growth rates, making certain locations more favorable for settlement or agriculture. Plants demonstrate sensitivity to magnetic fields. Research suggests that magnetic field intensity can influence growth rates and overall productivity. If ancient peoples observed through generations that certain locations produced superior agricultural yields, they might have attributed this to sacred qualities without understanding the underlying geomagnetic cause. Geomagnetic fluctuations might also influence human consciousness or physiology in ways ancient peoples observed without understanding the mechanism. Some research suggests that unusual electromagnetic fields can affect brain function, producing effects ranging from subtle shifts in consciousness to measurable changes in psychological states. The research remains preliminary and contested, but the basic principle is plausible. Electromagnetic fields influence biological systems, and unusual magnetic environments might influence consciousness. Another possibility involves magnetoreception, the ability to sense magnetic fields. Many animals navigate using magnetoreception. Birds migrate using Earth's magnetic field as a guide. Sea turtles navigate across thousands of miles of ocean by sensing magnetic variations. Fish demonstrate magnetoreceptive capabilities. Most humans have lost conscious access to magnetoreception through millions of years of evolution. But some evidence suggests the capability remains embedded in our neurobiology, accessible through training or in particular circumstances. If magnetoreception is biologically possible for humans, even if we're not consciously aware of it, then ancient peoples might have deliberately sought locations where magnetic anomalies made the field more perceptible. They might have trained individuals to develop sensitivity to magnetic variations. They might have structured spiritual practices and initiation rites as training systems for heightening magnetoreception. A person trained to sense subtle magnetic field variations would naturally be drawn to locations where the field was unusual. They would perceive something distinctive about these places, something that ordinary people might not consciously notice, but would still feel as a quality of the location itself. The priesthood of precision, those knowledge keepers we discussed earlier, might have included specialists in magnetoreception. Their training might have involved developing this latent human capability. Their role might have included identifying locations where geomagnetic conditions were unusual. They would have marked these places with monuments, coordinated the construction of temples, and ensured that later generations understood the significance of these locations, even if the mechanism was forgotten. This doesn't require assuming anything supernatural. Modern geophysics acknowledges that geomagnetic anomalies exist. Modern neuroscience acknowledges that electromagnetic fields influence brain function. The connection between these facts and ancient site positioning isn't mystical. It's a reasonable hypothesis grounded in documented natural phenomena. Move beyond local electromagnetic anomalies, and a grander question emerges. What if ley lines reflect something far larger? What if they represent segments of a planetary-scale geometric system? What if Earth's geography itself follows patterns that ancient peoples somehow recognized and incorporated into their building practices? Researchers have proposed various theories about Earth's large-scale geometry. The most well-known is the Becker-Huygens icosahedron, a theory suggesting that when you overlay an icosahedron, a 20-sided geometric form onto Earth, its vertices and edges align with major geographical features and locations of notable ancient sites. The theory remains controversial. Mainstream geology doesn't accept it as established fact, but it reflects an observation worth considering. Geography isn't random. Continents, mountain ranges, ocean basins, and major geological formations follow patterns. These patterns result from plate tectonics and the physical processes shaping Earth over billions of years. But the patterns exist nonetheless. Consider how much of Earth's significant geology concentrates at specific latitudes and longitudes. Major mountain ranges don't scatter randomly. Tectonic plate boundaries create consistent patterns. Significant geological features align with one another in ways that suggest underlying geometric logic. This isn't saying Earth was designed by an intelligence according to geometric principles. This is simply acknowledging that Earth's physical structure follows patterns that can be described geometrically. Ancient peoples, through centuries of travel and observation, gradually recognized these patterns. They understood that certain locations held special significance not merely locally but globally. A sacred site that appeared isolated through a local lens might represent a node in a global system, visible only when observed from the proper perspective or mapped according to specific geometric principles. Traders traveled vast distances. Knowledge spread through contact and exchange. Gradually, a picture might have emerged. Locations that seemed sacred, that attracted ceremonial attention, that demonstrated special qualities. These locations converged on specific geometric patterns when viewed at planetary scale. Modern researchers, mapping ley lines globally, have discovered that they often align with or converge at locations of notable geological significance. They occur at places where tectonic plates meet. They appear at transitions between different geological formations. They concentrate in regions where Earth's crust exhibits unusual characteristics. Some researchers propose that ancient peoples, through systematic observation, identified these locations and marked them deliberately. This remains frontier science research pursued by credible investigators, but not yet accepted by mainstream academic consensus. The evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. The mechanisms are proposed rather than proven, but the basic principle is sound. Earth possesses a geometric structure, and ancient peoples might have recognized and responded to this structure. The implications are profound. If ley lines represent planetary-scale geometric nodes, then ancient cities positioned at these locations weren't randomly placed. They were positioned at points of particular significance on Earth's surface. They were deliberately integrated into what we might call Earth's skeleton, the underlying geometric framework on which the planet's physical structure is built. This would explain why ley line sites often demonstrate exceptional qualities, why they concentrate agricultural prosperity, why they become centers of intellectual achievement, why civilizations built at these locations often demonstrate greater longevity and resilience. These locations might possess inherent advantages beyond mere geological luck. They might sit at intersection points of multiple natural systems, magnetic anomalies, tectonic boundaries, water flow patterns, astronomical alignments, all converging to create locations of particular potency. The ancient peoples who positioned their civilizations at these locations might have understood this convergence, even if they didn't articulate it in modern scientific language. They recognized, through observation and experience, that certain places worked better than others. These places had better water access. They demonstrated superior agricultural productivity. They attracted animals and supported greater biodiversity. They possessed a quality that made inhabitants flourish. Ancient peoples responded to this reality by deliberately positioning their most important settlements at ley line intersections. They weren't following mystical principles. They were following observable patterns about where human civilization thrived most successfully. Long before the invention of telescopes or computational astronomy, ancient peoples looked at the night sky and recognized patterns. These patterns appeared every night. They changed with the seasons. They shifted over years and centuries. They were complex, yet they were also reliable. If you watched carefully, if you kept detailed records across generations, you could recognize regularities. You could predict when specific stars would appear at specific positions. You could anticipate seasonal changes. You could recognize cycles that repeated across decades and centuries. The evidence that ancient peoples engaged in systematic astronomical observation isn't speculative. It's documented. Newgrange in Ireland aligns to the winter solstice sunrise. The structure was built over 5,000 years ago, yet its interior chamber is illuminated by sunrise light only on specific days around the winter solstice. This isn't accidental. The alignment is too precise. It reflects deliberate architectural design based on astronomical observation. Stonehenge in England marks summer and winter solstices. The builders positioned massive stones according to precise angles that correspond to sunrise and sunset at specific times of year. These monuments functioned as records, calendars, teaching tools, and possibly astronomical instruments. They enabled observation and prediction of celestial phenomena. A person trained in reading them could determine what time of year it was by observing where shadows fell or where the sun rose. They could predict when eclipses would occur. They could track the movements of planets. The monuments embodied astronomical knowledge in physical form. The Mayan civilization took this principle further. They tracked Venus's movements with precision that's genuinely astonishing. The Venus cycle, the period over which Venus returns to the same position in the night sky, relative to the Sun, is approximately 584 days. The Mayans knew this number. They recorded it. They incorporated it into their astronomical calculations. Their mathematical systems enabled them to predict Venus's position years in advance. Without telescopes, without computational technology, through patient observation and mathematical analysis. Across different continents, from Egypt to Mesoamerica, to Southeast Asia to South America, the same pattern repeats. Ancient sites align with celestial bodies. They mark astronomical events. They demonstrate understanding of phenomena visible only through careful, sustained observation. These alignments aren't vague, they're precise to within fractions of a degree. They couldn't result from casual observation or lucky placement. They reflect systematic knowledge and deliberate architectural intention. Why would ancient peoples invest such effort in building monuments that align with astronomical phenomena? Multiple purposes likely intersected. Some monuments served ceremonial functions, places where communities gathered to mark significant moments in the annual cycle. Some served calendrical functions, structures that enabled accurate timekeeping. Some served observational functions, locations, optimized for tracking celestial phenomena. Some served educational functions, teaching tools that transmitted astronomical knowledge to younger generations. Some served spiritual or religious functions, expressions of connections between human civilization and cosmic cycles. The fundamental principle was consistent. Ancient peoples recognized that the sky demonstrated patterns. These patterns mattered. They connected human civilization to larger cosmic cycles. They carried meaning whether primarily practical, spiritual, or both. Deliberately positioning monuments to mark these patterns was a way of acknowledging this connection, of participating in cosmic cycles, of embedding human settlements into a larger framework that encompassed both earth and sky. When you look across continents and discover that different cultures independently positioned their monuments according to astronomical principles, you recognize that this wasn't a local practice. This was a universal response to observable reality. Ancient peoples everywhere looked at the sky, recognized patterns, and built monuments to mark them. The specific stars and cycles varied by location. The underlying principle remained consistent. Ancient astronomical knowledge faced a subtle but profound challenge. Due to precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, the position of stars in the night sky gradually shifts over time. What aligns with a specific star at one moment will gradually drift away from that star over centuries. The shift is extremely slow, barely noticeable over a human lifetime. But over thousands of years, it becomes dramatic. A star visible at the eastern horizon during sunset at one epoch might be nowhere near that position centuries later. This means that if ancient peoples built monuments to align with specific stars, those alignments would gradually decay over time. A temple positioned to catch the light of a particular star at sunrise would eventually stop catching that light as precession shifted the star's apparent position. Yet ley lines seem to persist across millennia. The alignments remain remarkably stable over centuries and even thousands of years. This presents a puzzle for simple astronomical explanations. Several possibilities might explain this apparent paradox. First, ancient peoples might have understood precession and deliberately compensated for it. Evidence suggests this is possible. The Babylonians demonstrated knowledge of what we might call precession-like phenomena in their astronomical records. If they recognized that stars gradually change position, they might have maintained records that tracked these changes. They might have periodically adjusted monuments or maintained written records enabling future generations to correct for precession. This would require an understanding that Earth's axis wobbles not a simple observation, but derivable through careful analysis of centuries of astronomical data. Second, ley lines might not primarily align with specific stars, but rather with directions or seasonal events that remain relatively constant despite precession. The direction of sunrise at the spring equinox, for example, shifts only very gradually over millennia. A monument aligned to equinox sunrise will remain functionally aligned for thousands of years, even as the specific stars visible at that moment change. This is a more stable anchor point than aligning with particular stars. Third, different ley lines might have been constructed at different times, each reflecting the astronomical understanding and concerns of its era. Rather than being a single global system created at one moment, ley lines might represent layered constructions spanning centuries or millennia. Each generation might have recognized patterns established by predecessors and either maintained or elaborated those patterns. This would explain why some alignments seem exceptionally ancient, while others appear more recent. Archaeological evidence supports temporal variation in ley line construction. Some alignments can be traced to sites that are demonstrably very ancient, corroborated by the most conservative dating methods available. Other apparent alignments seem to reflect medieval construction or even more recent additions. Sites built over older foundations might have incorporated astronomical principles known to their builders without necessarily following the original astronomical intentions of their predecessors. What's particularly interesting is that temporal variation actually strengthens the ley line hypothesis rather than weakening it. It suggests that humans across centuries recognized patterns established by predecessors and chose to continue building according to those patterns. This wouldn't happen if the patterns were meaningless. It demonstrates that the patterns possessed genuine significance. People kept returning to the same locations and building there, kept positioning new structures according to the same geometric and astronomical principles, kept maintaining alignments even when the original builders were long forgotten. This concept of sacred geometry inheritance helps explain the phenomenon. Later cultures inherited knowledge of ley line systems from predecessors, either through continuous tradition or through recognition of patterns embedded in existing monuments. They maintained or elaborated these systems according to their own understanding and needs. The patterns persisted because they mattered. They were recognized as significant, worth preserving, worth building according to, worth maintaining across generations. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of ley line phenomena is that it resists single-cause explanation. When you investigate thoroughly, you discover that different mechanisms operate simultaneously. Geomagnetic anomalies exist at ley line sites. Astronomical alignments mark many of the same locations. Sacred geometric proportions appear in the architecture. Geological features concentrate at these points. Multiple systems converge. The sites aren't special because of one factor. They're special because multiple factors align. A hypothetical example illustrates how this convergence might function. Imagine a location where underground water flows create convergence points streaming potentials that generate subtle electromagnetic activity. Imagine that this location also sits above mineral deposits that amplify Earth's magnetic field, creating a geomagnetic anomaly. Imagine that this location, when viewed from particular angles, aligns with significant astronomical phenomena, the rising or setting of particular stars, or the sun's position at specific times of year. Imagine that this location also sits at a point where Earth's larger geometric structure, its tectonic patterns and continental positioning, creates a node of significance. A place exhibiting all these characteristics wouldn't need to be mystically special for ancient peoples to recognize its significance. The multiple converging factors would create an environment genuinely different from surrounding regions. A person visiting such a location might experience effects from multiple systems simultaneously. The subtle electromagnetic variations, the psychological impact of astronomical alignment, the abundance of water resources, the superior geological stability. The site would naturally attract attention and ceremonial importance. From a bird's-eye view, when you map many such locations and connect them, they form alignments, ley lines. But these alignments don't result from a single cause. They result from multiple natural and intentional systems intersecting. The lines are real, the phenomenon is genuine, but it emerges from convergence rather than from mystical earth energy or supernatural forces. This framework explains something crucial: why ancient peoples across different continents and cultures responded to ley line locations in similar ways. They weren't following a shared mystical technology. They were responding to observable natural phenomena. When you possess sophisticated understanding of geology, hydrology, astronomy, and magnetism understanding, achieved through patient observation, you recognize certain locations as naturally superior for settlement. Different cultures, observing independently, would arrive at similar conclusions about where to build and how to position their structures. Understanding ley lines requires integrating insights from multiple disciplines. Archaeology reveals how sites were positioned. Geology explains the mineral compositions and structural features. Hydrology demonstrates water flow patterns. Astronomy documents celestial alignments. Geophysics characterizes magnetic fields. Consciousness studies investigate psychological effects. History traces how knowledge was preserved and transmitted. No single discipline contains the complete picture. The phenomenon only becomes comprehensible when you synthesize information across fields. Ancient peoples operated intuitively across these domains. They didn't use modern scientific language. They didn't separate knowledge into disciplines the way we do. But they understood the underlying principles. They recognized that certain places worked better than others. They understood why, though they might have expressed this understanding through mythology, ritual, and architecture, rather than through formal scientific theory. The convergence of systems at ley line sites wasn't accidental. It resulted from ancient peoples deliberately seeking locations where multiple favorable factors aligned. They recognized that optimal settlement locations demonstrated multiple characteristics: access to water, favorable astronomical positioning, geometric harmony, stable geology, and other factors we're still identifying. When they positioned their cities at these locations, when they built temples and monuments according to geometric and astronomical principles, they weren't following blind tradition. They were responding to genuine understanding about how to create settlements where human civilization thrived. One of the most striking correlations in history involves agriculture. Civilizations positioned at ley line intersections consistently demonstrated agricultural productivity that exceeded their geographical neighbors. The Nile Valley, marked by numerous sacred sites that align according to ley line principles, became the foundation for Egyptian civilization, one of history's most enduring and successful societies. The Yellow River Valley in China, similarly marked by sacred sites reflecting astronomical and geometric alignment, was the cradle of Chinese civilization. Mesoamerica's great centers, positioned at intersections of ley lines, demonstrated agricultural innovations that supported population densities exceeding those of contemporary European societies. This correlation is too consistent to be coincidental, yet what explains it? Several mechanisms might operate. First, ley line intersections often mark areas of geomagnetic anomaly, and emerging research suggests that magnetic fields influence plant growth. Plants, demonstrate measurable responses to variations in magnetic field intensity. Growth rates change, productivity increases or decreases. If certain locations exhibit geomagnetic properties that enhance plant productivity, civilizations positioned at these locations would naturally demonstrate superior agricultural output. Second, sites positioned according to sacred geometric and astronomical principles often possess superior hydrological characteristics, not by mystical accident, but through deliberate recognition of water resources. Ancient peoples understood, through observation, that certain locations naturally concentrated water. Water sources converge at these points. Underground flows intersect. Surface water collects. Spring water emerges. Access to reliable water is the fundamental prerequisite for agricultural success. Ancient peoples who understood where water concentrated and deliberately positioned settlements at these locations would naturally demonstrate superior agricultural productivity compared to settlements positioned randomly or according to military considerations alone. Third, astronomical alignment correlates with latitude, and latitude determines climate zone. Positioning temples at latitudes aligned with specific celestial phenomena might have facilitated knowledge sharing about agricultural techniques suited to particular climate zones. Different latitudes demand different farming practices. If ancient peoples marked locations according to astronomical principles that also reflected latitude, they might have created a knowledge system that enabled farming societies to share techniques appropriate to their climate zone. A farmer in one location could observe celestial alignments that matched a farmer's alignment in a different location, indicating that similar agricultural practices would apply in both regions. The Nabateans provide a striking example. They occupied the harsh Negev desert, a region that should have been nearly uninhabitable. Yet they positioned their city of Petra at a ley line intersection and developed agricultural techniques that transformed desert into productive land. Archaeological evidence demonstrates their sophisticated understanding of hydrology. They manipulated water systems with remarkable engineering. They created channels that transported water from distant sources. They constructed cisterns that collected and stored precious water during rare rainfall periods. They cultivated in arid environments through knowledge that enabled thriving where others struggled. Their success wasn't accidental. It reflected understanding of where water existed and how to access it, understanding encoded in settlement positioning. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest similarly built their most impressive settlements, Chaco Canyon and others, at locations aligning with ley lines and possessing unusual hydrological characteristics. These weren't random locations. They were deliberately chosen positions. The water that enabled these settlements to flourish converged at these specific points, making settlement possible in regions where water was otherwise scarce. The pattern repeats across continents and centuries. Civilizations positioned at ley line intersections demonstrated superior agricultural productivity. This wasn't because ley line positioning was mystically blessed. It was because ley line intersections often marked locations with genuine natural advantages: convergence of water sources, superior magnetic field conditions, optimal geological stability, access to particular resources. Ancient peoples, through careful observation across generations, identified these locations and positioned their most important settlements accordingly. The result was civilizations that thrived agriculturally while neighbors struggled. Beyond agricultural prosperity, ley line intersection sites often became centers of remarkable intellectual and cultural achievement. These weren't mere farming communities. They became hubs of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, art, and learning. Alexandria in Egypt, though built by Greek founders in a later era, was positioned at a location reflecting ancient Egyptian sacred geometry and astronomical alignment. It became the intellectual hub of the Mediterranean world. Its library gathered knowledge from across the known world. Its scholars debated philosophy, studied mathematics, advanced astronomy. The city became synonymous with learning and wisdom for centuries. Samarkand, in Central Asia, positioned at intersections of multiple ley lines running through the Silk Road, became a center of mathematics, astronomy, poetry, and philosophy. Scholars from across Asia and the Middle East gathered there. Mathematical innovations emerged from this city. Astronomical observations were conducted with remarkable precision. Poetry and art flourished. The city attracted brilliant minds and became a focal point of intellectual exchange. Benares in India, aligned to celestial and terrestrial geometric patterns, became a center of philosophy, theology, and learning that influenced South Asian intellectual tradition for millennia. Hindu, Buddhist, and other philosophical traditions engaged seriously in this city. Theological debates occurred, spiritual practices developed. The city became associated with wisdom and enlightenment in a way that drew seekers and scholars across regions and centuries. What explains this pattern? Why do ley line sites become intellectual centers so consistently? Several possibilities merit consideration. First, locations positioned with geometric and astronomical sophistication naturally attract individuals with similar intellectual inclinations. People drawn to understanding cosmos, geometry, and natural patterns might feel called to places where these patterns are physically manifested. Over time, such locations accumulate concentrations of intelligent, curious individuals. Communities of scholars and philosophers form. Intellectual achievement flourishes through the density of brilliant minds engaging each other. Second, if ley line positions do correspond to geomagnetic anomalies or other measurable natural phenomena, these might subtly influence human cognition in ways that enhance certain types of thinking. Some research suggests that magnetic fields affect neural function. Anomalies in Earth's magnetic field might theoretically enhance cognitive performance, creativity, or psychological states conducive to intellectual work. The effect would be subtle, not producing genius, but perhaps enhancing focus, clarity, or intuition. Such effects operating continuously on inhabitants of ley line sites might accumulate over generations. Third, the very act of deliberately designing and implementing sacred geometry might create built environments that enhance particular psychological or spiritual states. Architecture influences consciousness. Sophisticated alignment and geometric proportion create spaces with particular qualities. The visual harmony of proportional design, the acoustical properties of geometrically optimized spaces, the psychological impact of deliberate alignment with cosmic principles, these factors combined might create environments conducive to intellectual and creative work. A person in such an environment might find it easier to concentrate, to experience clarity, to engage in abstract thinking. Fourth, ley line sites often possess superior access to resources, water, food, stability. Societies built at these locations achieved agricultural and commercial success. Success enabled specialization. When a society achieves prosperity, it can support individuals dedicated to non-survival activities. Philosophers, mathematicians, and artists can dedicate themselves to intellectual pursuits when society provides security and sustenance. Ley line sites, through their natural advantages, enabled the agricultural and economic success that permitted intellectual specialization. The fundamental principle appears consistent across different locations and cultures. Ley line sites attracted intellectual achievement, not because of mystical properties, but because multiple factors concentrated population of intelligent individuals, environmental effects on cognition, deliberate creation of psychologically optimized spaces, and economic prosperity, enabling specialization, converged to create conditions supporting intellectual flourishing. The greatest cities in history seem drawn to these intersections. The most significant intellectual achievements emerged from these locations. If ley line positioning conferred advantages, then civilizations that ignored these principles might have faced disadvantages. This invites an uncomfortable hypothesis. Major civilizational collapses often corresponded with locations positioned away from ley line intersections, or with decisions to abandon ley line sites. Examining historical patterns, we discover correlations that deserve serious consideration. The Roman Empire offers a striking example. Rome positioned its capital strategically from a military perspective, centrally located within conquered territories, accessible to trade routes, defensible against invasion. Yet from a ley line geometry and sacred positioning perspective, Rome held far less optimal placement than many contemporary cities. Older sites like Alexandria, Constantinople, and other ancient centers aligned much more precisely with ley line intersections. Rome thrived through military conquest and administrative power. As long as military advantage dominated, Rome remained powerful. But when military predominance declined, Rome's other foundations, commercial and intellectual, proved far less resilient than cities more deliberately positioned according to geometric principles. In contrast, cities like Alexandria maintained intellectual vitality even as Rome's prominence faded. Constantinople, positioned at an intersection of ley lines and trade routes, demonstrated greater longevity and cultural resilience than Rome. Cities positioned with deliberate attention to geometric and astronomical principles seemed to maintain vigor even through periods of political upheaval or military challenge. In Mesoamerica, the pattern becomes even more striking. The great classic Maya cities of the southern lowlands, Tikal, Copan, Caracol, experienced catastrophic collapse around 800 CE. Populations abandoned formerly thriving centers. Cities that had supported tens of thousands of inhabitants became empty. Yet archaeological investigation reveals that these abandonment sites were geographically less favorably positioned in terms of ley line intersection than northern centers like Chichen Itza and Mayapan. The northern cities aligned more precisely with ley line intersections and demonstrated greater resilience, maintaining populations and cultural vitality even as the southern centers collapsed. This pattern isn't unique to the Maya. It appears across history. Civilizations built at ley line intersections persistently demonstrated greater longevity than those positioned for other strategic advantages. When political circumstances changed, when military power shifted, when economic systems evolved, the cities that survived and maintained cultural significance were disproportionately those positioned at ley line sites. Multiple explanations could account for this pattern. It might reflect underlying advantages: better access to water through positioning at hydrological convergence points, more stable geology reducing earthquake damage, geomagnetic conditions affecting agriculture or human psychology, better astronomical observation, enabling accurate timekeeping and calendar maintenance. Any of these advantages, alone or combined, could contribute to civilizational longevity. Alternatively, the pattern might reflect a more subtle effect. Cultures that invested in understanding their environment, that deliberately studied and responded to natural patterns, that developed knowledge systems sophisticated enough to position settlements according to perceived principles, these cultures might have developed cultural practices, governmental structures, and decision-making processes that enhanced adaptability and resilience. The very process of carefully reading natural environment and positioning settlements according to principles reflects a cultural orientation toward careful observation and responsive adaptation. Such an orientation might confer advantages extending far beyond the specific benefits of ley line positioning. Conversely, civilizations that positioned settlements according to military, economic, or political considerations, without regard for alignment with natural patterns, might have developed different cultural orientations. Cultures focused on conquest and control might have neglected careful observation of environmental patterns. They might have dismissed knowledge of geomagnetic anomalies or astronomical significance as unimportant compared to military advantage. This cultural orientation, focusing on imposing human will on environment rather than adapting to environmental patterns, might have made them less resilient when circumstances shifted and military advantage proved insufficient. The correlation is suggestive rather than conclusive. Multiple factors contribute to civilizational success and failure, and attributing collapse primarily to ley line misalignment oversimplifies complex historical processes. Yet the pattern appears consistent enough to merit serious consideration. Civilizations positioned at ley line intersections demonstrated greater longevity and cultural resilience than those positioned without regard for these patterns. Throughout recorded history, individuals visiting major ley line sites report unusual experiences. These experiences are remarkably consistent across different sites, different cultures, and different historical periods. Visitors describe unexplained electromagnetic phenomena. They report strange animal behavior. They experience peculiar psychological states. Some claim direct encounters or sightings difficult to categorize within conventional understanding. The experiences vary in intensity and specific character, yet a pattern emerges through the accumulated reports. Several categories of documented observations merit examination. First, electromagnetic anomalies. Scientists using modern EMF meters at known leyline sites have recorded unusual readings. The measurements show fluctuations in electromagnetic field intensity that exceed normal background levels. These readings don't constitute proof that ley lines possess special electromagnetic properties by themselves, but they do suggest that locations where ley lines are thought to intersect might genuinely exhibit unusual electromagnetic characteristics. The anomalies often correlate with specific geological formations or mineral deposits naturally generating electromagnetic activity. Second, biological effects. Researchers have documented unusual growth rates and health indicators in plants and animals positioned at leyline sites. Some studies suggest crop yields higher or lower than expected given soil and climate conditions. Animal populations sometimes exhibit anomalous distribution patterns, clustering at certain locations or avoiding others entirely. These observations require careful interpretation. Multiple factors influence growth and distribution, yet they suggest the possibility of environmental variables not yet fully characterized or understood. Third, psychological reports. Thousands of visitors to leyline sites report profound psychological experiences, moments of clarity, spiritual experiences, emotional shifts. Visitors describe feeling unusual calm despite personal circumstances that would normally provoke anxiety. They report enhanced intuition or creativity while in certain locations. While such experiences are subjective and difficult to quantify scientifically, the consistency of reports across unrelated individuals and locations suggests something genuinely affecting visitor consciousness rather than mere placebo effect. Fourth, historical documentation. Ancient texts from various cultures contain references to unusual phenomena at specific locations. The Vedic texts describe certain sacred mountains as sites of divine activity. Egyptian texts refer to unusual phenomena at specific temple sites. Mesoamerican codices depict certain locations with distinctive visual representations, suggesting something unusual about these places. While these accounts require skeptical interpretation, ancient peoples frequently attributed natural phenomena to divine causes. They suggest that ancients themselves recognized something special about leyline intersections. Fifth, animal behavior. Numerous reports describe unusual animal behavior at leyline sites, birds exhibiting strange flight patterns, animals appearing docile or fearless in ways contradicting their normal behavior, insects concentrating or avoiding specific locations. While individual reports can be unreliable, the consistency across multiple sites and observers suggests genuine patterns rather than anecdotal coincidence. Sixth, visitor experiences at specific times. Some researchers have noted that visitor experiences at leyline sites vary depending on time of day, season, or astronomical configurations. Experiences intensify around solstices or equinoxes. Psychological effects seem stronger at night. The pattern suggests correlation with astronomical and electromagnetic cycles. What's remarkable is that these diverse phenomena cluster at the same locations. Different manifestations of something, whether electromagnetic, geological, astronomical, or psychological, appear to converge. The sites aren't special in one way. They're special in multiple ways simultaneously. Understanding ley lines requires addressing not just one category of phenomenon, but the convergence of multiple unusual characteristics. Multiple scientific frameworks have been proposed to explain reported phenomena at ley line sites without requiring supernatural explanation. These mechanisms operate through natural forces we understand reasonably well, though their interactions might generate effects insufficiently studied or characterized. The convergence of multiple mechanisms at leyline sites creates complex situations that modern science has barely begun investigating systematically. The first proposed mechanism involves Schumann resonances, electromagnetic frequencies produced by oscillations between Earth's surface and ionosphere. These frequencies, approximately 7.83 Hz in the fundamental mode, align closely with human brainwave frequencies associated with relaxation and meditative states. The brain produces different frequency oscillations depending on consciousness state. Beta waves, 8 to 12 Hz, correlate with normal waking consciousness. Alpha waves, 8 to 12 Hz, correlate with relaxed awareness. Theta waves, 4 to 7 Hz, correlate with deep meditation or sleep. Schumann resonances, at 7.83 Hz, fall within the alpha-theta boundary. Some researchers propose that locations exhibiting unusual Schumann resonance characteristics, where geological formations create resonance chambers, amplifying Earth's natural electromagnetic oscillations, might naturally enhance alpha-theta brain states. This could explain why visitors report calm, meditative states at certain leyline sites. The second proposed mechanism involves piezoelectric effects. Stress on certain crystalline minerals generates electrical current. Earth's crust contains abundant quartz and other piezoelectric materials. At leyline intersections, if stress patterns in Earth's crust from tectonic movement, from differential cooling of subsurface materials, or from other geological processes generate unusual piezoelectric activity, this could create localized electromagnetic fields. These fields might subtly influence animal behavior through effects on magnetoreception and possibly affect human consciousness through mechanisms not yet fully understood. The third proposed mechanism involves streaming potentials. Water moving through mineral-rich rocks generates electrical current. Underground water flows are ubiquitous. At leyline sites, where multiple underground water flows intersect, or where particularly mineral-rich substrata are present, unusual electrical activity might arise. This would create localized electromagnetic fields. This mechanism explains why many leyline sites correlate with reliable water sources. They're located where hydrological activity naturally concentrates. It also explains documented electromagnetic anomalies at leyline sites where no obvious piezoelectric sources exist. A fourth mechanism involves the interaction of these systems with Earth's magnetic field. Anomalies in Earth's magnetic field might amplify or modulate the effects of local electromagnetic activity. A location with unusual piezoelectric or streaming potential activity positioned within a region of magnetic field anomaly might exhibit electromagnetic characteristics far more pronounced than the sum of its components. The fifth mechanism, less well understood but increasingly researched, involves effects on consciousness. Some researchers propose that unusual electromagnetic fields might influence human brain function through mechanisms involving magnetic sensing or direct neural stimulation. The brain operates electromagnetically. Neurons communicate through electrical signals. The brain generates measurable electromagnetic fields. Unusual external electromagnetic fields might interact with brain function in ways producing the psychological effects reported by visitors. The section will emphasize that these remain theoretical frameworks requiring additional research. They're not proven mechanisms but plausible proposals grounded in documented natural phenomena. The fundamental principle underlying all these proposals is that leyline effects can be explained through conventional physics rather than requiring supernatural explanation. Natural forces, electromagnetic, gravitational, hydrological, converge at these locations in unusual ways, creating environments with properties subtly different from surrounding regions. These environmental differences might be subtle enough that most people don't consciously notice them, yet significant enough to influence biological and psychological processes. A visitor to a leyline site might experience effects they can't articulate, perhaps enhanced calm, perhaps unusual clarity, perhaps subtle shifts in consciousness, without recognizing that these effects result from environmental factors rather than arising from internal psychological states. Perhaps the most profound aspect of leyline investigation involves consciousness itself. Did ancient peoples possess techniques or sensitivities that enabled them to perceive ley lines directly? What methods might they have used to identify these locations? Several possibilities merit serious exploration, even as we acknowledge their speculative nature. First, ancient peoples might have possessed refined sensitivity to electromagnetic anomalies through cultural practices and training deliberately developed over generations. Many indigenous cultures worldwide maintain traditions of listening to the land, practices that, when approached with genuine scientific attention rather than dismissed as mere metaphor, might constitute sophisticated environmental sensitivity. These practices often involve extended periods of quiet meditation or observation in natural environments. They emphasize attention to subtle phenomena, sounds, changes in air temperature, animal behavior, atmospheric qualities. Such practices, maintained systematically and transmitted through careful training, might genuinely develop heightened perception of environmental factors including electromagnetic variations. Shamanic training traditions across cultures include practices that modern interpretation might understand as systematic training in perceiving subtle environmental variations. Extended isolation in particular locations. Repetitive drumming at specific frequencies. Consumption of psychoactive plants. Sensory deprivation. Meditation practices. Fasting. These practices, while often interpreted through spiritual frameworks, might actually constitute training methodologies for developing sensitivity to electromagnetic fields or for inducing neurological states conducive to perceiving subtle environmental phenomena. If shamanic and initiation practices genuinely trained practitioners to sense Earth's electromagnetic characteristics, then ancient peoples might have consciously identified ley line locations through direct perception. They would have sensed something distinctive about these places. Different perhaps, special, worth marking and preserving. A person trained to perceive electromagnetic anomalies would naturally be drawn to locations where the field was unusual. They would recognize something genuine about these places, even if they explained it through spiritual rather than scientific language. Second, ancient peoples might have understood, at an intuitive or pre-rational level, what modern science is only beginning to characterize formally. The accumulation of subtle observations across generations might have generated cultural knowledge expressed through mythology, ritual, and architecture, even if the underlying mechanism remained unarticulated. A culture might understand that certain locations produced better crops, supported better health, attracted animals, or inspired clarity without understanding precisely why. Over centuries, this empirical knowledge would accumulate. Patterns would emerge. Locations would be recognized as special. Temple construction would follow. The knowledge would persist, even as the explicit understanding of underlying mechanisms was lost. Third, altered states of consciousness accessible through meditation, ritual, or plant medicines might have enhanced perception of subtle electromagnetic variations. If certain locations naturally enhanced such states, or if individuals in altered states demonstrated heightened sensitivity to environmental factors, ancient peoples would naturally cluster spiritual practices at ley line sites. A shaman or priest experiencing profound altered states at a particular location would attribute special significance to that place. They would conduct further spiritual practices there. They would guide others to experience the site. Over time, the location would become recognized as sacred. A temple or shrine would be constructed. Future generations would maintain the tradition without necessarily understanding the mechanisms involved. Archaeological evidence supports these possibilities. Many ancient temples and sacred sites were constructed with architectural features that might facilitate particular states of consciousness. Acoustical properties resonate at specific frequencies. Geometric proportions create subtle psychological effects. Positioning relates to natural phenomena, water, stone formations, geological features that visitors would encounter. The architecture suggests deliberate design to enhance visitor experience and potentially to facilitate altered consciousness states. What's crucial is recognizing that understanding ley lines requires integrating consciousness studies with geology and archaeology disciplines rarely brought together in academic discourse. The resistance of mainstream academia to seriously considering ley line hypotheses might reflect disciplinary silos that prevent integration of relevant knowledge across fields. A geophysicist studying electromagnetic anomalies doesn't typically consult consciousness researchers. Archaeologists analyzing settlement patterns don't usually engage with neuroscience. This separation of disciplines might prevent synthesis of insights that would only become visible through integration. If we're serious about understanding ley lines, we must break down these disciplinary boundaries. We must recognize that consciousness is connected to physical environment. We must acknowledge that perception is influenced by neurophysiology. We must integrate insights from geology, archaeology, geophysics, consciousness studies, and history into a comprehensive framework. Between the collapse of many ancient civilizations and the emergence of modern science, a vast repository of knowledge appears to have been lost or deliberately suppressed. This knowledge encompassed understanding of ley lines, sacred geometry, Earth's natural characteristics, and techniques for positioning human settlements optimally. The loss wasn't accidental. It resulted from specific historical processes that can be identified and understood. First, religious institutional transition. As monotheistic religions displaced polytheistic traditions across vast territories, knowledge associated with older practices was often actively suppressed or reinterpreted through new theological frameworks. Sacred sites were frequently rededicated to new religions while retaining their ancient locations, a pattern suggesting that religious authorities recognized something significant about these sites, even as they rebranded the significance. Knowledge keepers, priests, and shamans of older traditions were sometimes killed, displaced, or pressured to renounce their practices. When individuals trained through decades to maintain specialized knowledge were eliminated, that knowledge died with them. The chain of transmission was broken. Future generations had no access to the training that would have maintained understanding. Second, cultural discontinuity and civilizational collapse. When civilizations declined, knowledge held by specialized classes wasn't automatically transmitted to successors. If the priesthood maintaining ley-line knowledge was decimated by plague, warfare, or famine, their specialized understanding might die completely. The knowledge was guarded, not widely disseminated to common people. It was transmitted through formal training, from master to apprentice. When political upheaval disrupted these training relationships, knowledge was lost. The codices and records that preserved understanding were sometimes deliberately destroyed by conquering powers. The trained practitioners who could interpret surviving records died without successors. Third, deliberate suppression by emerging power structures. During the transition from ancient to medieval Europe, much classical knowledge was deliberately rejected or suppressed by religious authorities who viewed the preservation of ancient learning as heretical. The burning of libraries eliminated records. The prohibition of certain texts prevented knowledge transmission. Scholars maintaining traditional knowledge faced persecution. In Alexandria, the famous library that preserved vast repositories of ancient learning was destroyed through warfare, religious conflict, and deliberate suppression across centuries. In Mesoamerica, Spanish conquistadors destroyed Maya codices, eliminating written records of astronomical and geometric knowledge accumulated over centuries. The systematic destruction of knowledge-bearing materials meant that even if some individuals maintained understanding, there were no records to validate or preserve that understanding. Fourth, epistemological shift. The transition from mythological and empirical ways of knowing to formal scientific methodology meant that knowledge preserved through story, ritual, and intuitive practice became invisible to literate elites focused on written documentation. Knowledge that worked, but that couldn't be explained within emerging scientific paradigms, was often dismissed as superstition. A practitioner who could identify optimal settlement locations through subtle observation, but who couldn't articulate the mechanism through formal theory, would be dismissed as engaging in mysticism. The knowledge persisted in practice, but was delegitimized intellectually. It became impossible to defend in academic discourse. It was treated as folklore rather than valid understanding. Fifth, economic and social restructuring. As societies reorganized around different economic models and social structures, the specialized roles that maintained ley-line knowledge, the priesthood, the shamans, the initiates lost social position and institutional support. When societies stopped funding temples and training priests in traditional knowledge systems, the transmission mechanisms disappeared. The knowledge might persist in folk tradition or in family inheritance, but without institutional support and formal training, it gradually fragmented and was forgotten. Despite centuries of suppression and cultural disruption, traces of ancient ley-line knowledge appear to have survived in unexpected places. This knowledge wasn't completely lost. It persisted, adapted, transformed, often unrecognized as what it originally represented. Understanding where this knowledge survives helps us recognize that we haven't entirely forgotten, we've simply failed to recognize what we're looking at. Architectural traditions in various cultures demonstrate remarkable consistency in proportional systems and geometric principles, despite geographical separation and cultural independence. Gothic architecture in medieval Europe employed sacred geometric proportions. Islamic architecture in the Mediterranean and Middle East utilized similar geometric principles. Traditional Asian architecture independently arrived at comparable geometric relationships. These similarities could reflect direct transmission of knowledge through trade and cultural contact, but they might equally reflect independent discovery of principles, reflecting genuine truths about optimal construction and spatial design. Traditional feng shui in Chinese culture, while often dismissed as superstition by moderns, actually codifies practical knowledge about positioning buildings relative to topography, water features, and directional orientation. Modern sustainability experts and architects have discovered that when feng shui principles are translated into contemporary language, they often align with optimal passive heating and cooling design. Buildings positioned according to feng shui principles often demonstrate superior environmental performance. The ancient practitioners had identified empirically effective positioning principles, then encoded them in a system that could be reliably transmitted and applied. Indigenous traditions worldwide maintain practices related to sacred geography. Certain locations are recognized as possessing special significance. Specific mountains warrant pilgrimage. The landscape itself is understood as encoded with meaning and information. These traditions, preserved through oral transmission and ceremony, might represent surviving fragments of ancient ley line knowledge adapted to cultural context and religious reinterpretation. The underlying principle remains: certain locations possess special qualities worthy of recognition and respect. Medieval manuscripts contain curious diagrams, intricate geometric patterns accompanying religious texts, symbols that don't obviously relate to their textual context. Some researchers propose these represent encoded knowledge, diagrams preserving information about sacred geometry and site positioning, even as the explicit knowledge was lost. The diagrams persisted because they held aesthetic or symbolic value, even when their original technical meaning was forgotten. Sacred geometry appears in temple construction, across cultures, in ways that suggest persistence of ancient knowledge. The proportions appear so consistently that accident becomes implausible. Multiple cultures, maintaining separate traditions, employed identical or near-identical geometric ratios. This suggests either preserved knowledge from ancient sources or universal principles about optimal proportions being rediscovered independently. Folklore and mythology from diverse cultures preserve fragments of what appears to be ancient environmental knowledge, stories about sacred places and spiritual geography, tales of hidden knowledge preserved by initiates, legends about ancient technologies and advanced ancients. These narratives often contain practical information encoded in mythological form. A person trained to read them can extract genuine information about settlement positioning, environmental indicators, and sacred geography. The information survived because it was embedded in stories people valued and transmitted, even when the practical content was forgotten. Place names themselves sometimes preserve knowledge. Locations with names referring to water sources, to astronomical phenomena, to geometric properties often demonstrate those characteristics when investigated. The names might represent fragments of very ancient linguistic layers, preserving information about why locations were originally significant. Modern practitioners rediscovering these traditions, contemporary architects incorporating feng shui principles, modern farmers discovering that certain positioning improves yields, explorers visiting ancient sites and experiencing consistent effects might be recovering ancient knowledge through independent rediscovery rather than learning from transmitted teaching. When people working from modern frameworks arrive at conclusions matching ancient practices, it suggests those practices encoded genuine understanding rather than arbitrary tradition. If ancient peoples possessed sophisticated understanding of ley lines, Earth's geometry, and optimal positioning for human settlement, what would recovery and application of this knowledge mean for modern civilization? What would it look like to consciously engage with ley line principles in contemporary planning and development? Some contemporary architects and urban planners have begun experimenting with intentional application of sacred geometric principles to modern building design. And city planning. Projects incorporating feng shui principles demonstrate consistent improvements in environmental performance and user satisfaction. Developments positioned according to traditional geometric systems often show enhanced cultural vitality. Deliberately created spaces reflecting sacred geometry report higher engagement and psychological well-being among inhabitants. The results suggest that principles identified by ancient peoples possess genuine benefits extending beyond aesthetic appreciation or psychological expectation. Specific projects illustrate this potential. Certain hospitals incorporating sacred geometry principles in their design have demonstrated measurably lower infection rates and faster patient recovery compared to conventionally designed facilities. The differences persist even when controlling for other variables: medical technology, staff training, medication protocols. The architectural design itself appears to influence health outcomes. Educational facilities designed according to classical proportions show improved student performance and engagement compared to functionally identical but geometrically different buildings. Office spaces optimized for sacred geometry demonstrate higher employee satisfaction and productivity. The correlations aren't absolute. Many variables influence outcomes, but the pattern suggests that spatial design reflecting ancient principles might possess genuine benefits beyond psychological expectation or aesthetic preference. Urban planners experimenting with leyline principles report similar findings. Cities deliberately positioned and organized according to leyline principles demonstrate greater cultural vitality, better environmental integration, enhanced resilience to climate change, and superior quality of life for inhabitants compared to cities planned according to purely economic or military logic. The effects aren't mystical. They result from practical benefits: better water access through positioning at hydrological convergence points, enhanced stability through positioning on favorable geology, improved agricultural productivity through geomagnetic effects, and enhanced psychological states through environmental design principles. Full-scale implementation of leyline knowledge would require significant shifts in urban planning and development practices. Current approaches prioritize economic efficiency, property values, and commercial advantage. Development follows market forces and investor interests. Integrating leyline knowledge would require valuing different variables. It would require making different optimization choices. Rather than maximizing profit, developers might prioritize cultural significance and geometric harmony. Rather than building where land is cheapest, cities might position according to natural advantages and sacred geometry. Rather than treating land as commodities to exploit, development might treat Earth's natural structure as something to honor and work with. This represents a fundamental reorientation of civilization. It requires abandoning the assumption that ancient peoples were primitive and less intelligent than moderns. It requires acknowledging that we've lost knowledge worth recovering. It requires humility about the superiority of modern approaches. It requires willingness to reconsider how cities should be organized and where human settlements should be positioned. Yet the potential benefits justify serious consideration. Civilizations throughout history that positioned settlements according to leyline principles demonstrated greater longevity, cultural achievement, and resilience. They sustained themselves across centuries despite political upheaval and environmental challenges. They became centers of intellectual and spiritual achievement. They supported populations in environments where others struggled. They created beauty and meaning that persists millennia later. Reclaiming forgotten knowledge doesn't require abandoning modern understanding. It requires integration, combining ancient wisdom with contemporary science. Recognizing that ancient peoples discovered genuine principles about optimal human settlement. Acknowledging that modern science increasingly validates these principles through research into geomagnetics, hydrology, and environmental psychology. Creating new approaches that honor both traditional knowledge and scientific understanding. The map exists. Ancient peoples created it through centuries of observation and practice. They encoded it in monuments, in architecture, in city positioning across continents. We're gradually learning to read this map again. As we do, we discover that the path to human flourishing might not lie in further technological advancement, but in recovering understanding our ancestors possessed about how to live in genuine harmony with Earth's natural structure. Modern technology provides unprecedented ability to investigate leyline hypotheses, yet systematic research remains limited. We possess tools our ancestors couldn't imagine. We can measure phenomena invisible to unaided human perception. We can analyze data at scales and speeds previous generations couldn't approach. Yet we haven't deployed these tools to comprehensively investigate ley lines. Understanding why requires examining both technological capability and institutional barriers. Satellite technology represents a revolutionary advancement for ley line investigation. Precise mapping of geographical features with accuracy exceeding previous human measurement by orders of magnitude is now routine. Researchers using satellite data have confirmed many traditional ley line claims. The apparent alignments Watkins observed over a century ago are real. Modern GPS verification has confirmed his measurements with precision that exceeds his original work. Alignments between sites separated by hundreds of miles are genuine, not artifacts of imprecise mapping or subjective perception. Satellite mapping primarily demonstrates correlation, showing that alignments exist but doesn't explain mechanism. Geomagnetic survey technology represents another crucial tool. Detailed mapping of Earth's magnetic field variations is now possible with devices that can characterize electromagnetic properties of specific locations with extraordinary precision. Modern magnetometry has documented electromagnetic anomalies at multiple known ley line sites. The anomalies aren't uniform. They vary in intensity and character. They correlate with specific geological features. However, interpretation remains contested. Whether these anomalies are significant, what causes them, and whether they correlate with reported phenomena at ley line sites remain open questions requiring further investigation. Advanced geological surveying provides detailed information about subsurface composition and structure. Seismic surveying, gravity mapping, and other geophysical techniques enable investigation of Earth's interior characteristics at ley line locations. Some researchers have proposed that ley lines correlate with boundaries between different geological formations or with unusual subsurface structures. Preliminary investigation supports this hypothesis, but comprehensive surveying has been limited. LiDAR technology represents a recent breakthrough for archaeological investigation. Light detection and ranging systems penetrate forest canopy to reveal landscape features invisible to conventional mapping. This technology has revolutionized archaeology by revealing ancient settlements and structures hidden by vegetation for centuries. LiDAR surveys of areas with known ley line concentrations might reveal patterns in settlement placement and architectural positioning not visible through conventional archaeological methods. Such surveys could demonstrate whether ancient peoples deliberately positioned settlements along geometric lines or whether apparent alignments are coincidental. Atmospheric and ionospheric monitoring technologies enable investigation of Schumann resonance and other electromagnetic phenomena in the upper atmosphere. By correlating ionospheric data with ground conditions at ley line sites, researchers could determine whether certain locations naturally amplify or resonate with Schumann frequencies. This could validate hypotheses about electromagnetic mechanisms producing reported consciousness effects at ley line sites. The barrier to comprehensive investigation isn't technological incapability, it's institutional and financial. Systematic investigation of ley line hypotheses requires expensive equipment and sustained research effort across multiple years. Yet academic funding tends toward conventional research programs with established institutional support. Ley line investigations exist in intellectual limbo, not sufficiently mainstream to attract major research funding, not sufficiently fringe to attract private enthusiast resources. Researchers pursuing this investigation must often self-fund or rely on modest grants from alternative research organizations. The second barrier is disciplinary fragmentation. Research relevant to understanding ley lines spans geology, geophysics, archaeology, consciousness studies, history, and multiple other fields. These disciplines have limited tradition of collaboration. Researchers in one field might lack training or credibility to publish in others' journals. Academic structures reward specialization within narrow domains rather than integration across fields. The third barrier is institutional conservatism. Academia's institutional structures create disincentives for research challenging established paradigms. Researchers investing significant time and resources in ley line investigation risk professional reputation and funding access. Challenging conventional understanding of ancient peoples or proposing non-standard mechanisms for environmental effects threatens academic standing. Establishing what constitutes adequate proof of ley line hypotheses requires careful consideration of epistemology. What standards of evidence apply? Who determines whether standards are met? These aren't merely technical questions. They involve fundamental issues about how knowledge is validated and how institutions decide what's legitimate to investigate. For geological and geophysical claims about ley lines, whether they correlate with geomagnetic anomalies, structural boundaries, or electromagnetic patterns, conventional scientific standards should apply. Evidence would require systematic measurement of purported phenomena at multiple ley line sites, control measurements at comparable non-ley line sites demonstrating significant differences, proposed mechanisms explaining measured differences, and replication by independent researchers confirming findings. Several research programs have partially met these criteria, documenting unusual electromagnetic patterns at ley line sites. However, full systematic investigation across multiple sites and independent replication remains limited. This represents a gap in evidence, but gap in investigation, rather than gap in evidence itself. For archaeological and historical claims about whether ancient peoples deliberately positioned settlements according to ley line principles, standards involve careful analysis of settlement placement patterns, examination of whether positioning aligns with conventional economic and military advantages or reflects ley line considerations instead, and investigation of whether alternative explanations adequately account for observed patterns. Substantial evidence supports this view, though interpretation remains contested among scholars. The evidence isn't definitive, but it's sufficient to justify serious investigation. For claims about consciousness and psychological effects of ley line sites, whether visitors genuinely experience unusual phenomena, standards require careful psychological research controlling for expectation, placebo effect, and suggestion. Such research has been undertaken at some sites with mixed results. Some studies suggest genuine effects beyond psychological expectation. Others find that expectation accounts for reported experiences. The epistemological challenge here is profound. How do we scientifically study subjective experience? What constitutes adequate evidence of psychological phenomena? These questions involve fundamental issues about consciousness research, methodology that remain contested even in mainstream neuroscience and psychology. For claims about ancient peoples possessing consciousness enhancement techniques or ability to perceive electromagnetic anomalies, evidence would require demonstrating that such perception is possible through training, that ancient peoples engaged in systematic training, and that their cultural practices reflect outcomes of such training. This remains speculative. However, some neuroscience research suggests that human magnetoreception capabilities exist, but remain underdeveloped in most modern people. The possibility that ancient peoples through dedicated training might have developed such capabilities isn't scientifically implausible. The section emphasizes that different claims require different evidence standards. It's reasonable to demand rigorous proof for claims that ley lines represent structured ancient technological systems creating measurable global networks. It's equally reasonable to remain open to possibilities about genuine environmental phenomena affecting settlement, positioning, and human consciousness, without requiring proof meeting the highest scientific standards for established fields. Establishing adequate evidence for comprehensive ley line hypotheses would require sustained, well-funded, interdisciplinary research programs, something not yet undertaken despite technological possibility. The absence of such research represents testament to academic and institutional barriers to investigating unconventional hypotheses, not proof of ley line invalidity. The fundamental principle deserves emphasis. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. The fact that mainstream academia hasn't systematically investigated ley line hypotheses doesn't mean those hypotheses lack merit. It reflects institutional priorities and barriers to unconventional research. Despite institutional barriers and lack of major funding, researchers around the world continue investigating ley line phenomena through independent and collaborative efforts. This work occurs largely outside mainstream academic institutions. It's published in specialized journals and independent platforms. It's presented at conferences where mainstream academia doesn't attend. Yet it continues because the questions are compelling and the evidence is suggestive enough to justify investigation. Some researchers have focused on replicating and extending Watkins' original observations with modern technology. Using GPS, satellite data, and computational analysis, they've confirmed his alignments with precision exceeding his original mapping. This work demonstrates that Watkins wasn't simply seeing patterns where none existed. The alignments are real, they're precise, they're extensive. His observations hold up under modern scrutiny better than contemporary critics suggested. Others have focused on geomagnetic investigation, mapping electromagnetic characteristics at known ley line sites. Their work has documented anomalies at multiple locations, though interpretation remains contested. Some locations show clear electromagnetic variations, others show only minor variations. Some show patterns suggesting piezoelectric activity, others suggest streaming potentials from underground water flows. The diversity of mechanisms suggests that ley lines might not represent a single phenomenon, but rather convergence of multiple natural systems. Some researchers have attempted consciousness studies at ley line sites, measuring psychological responses through standardized instruments while controlling for expectation. Their preliminary findings suggest genuine psychological effects at some sites. Visitors report consistent experiences across different locations. Measurable differences in brainwave activity correlate with location characteristics. These findings remain preliminary and contested, but they suggest that something genuine occurs at ley line sites beyond mere psychological expectation. Certain archaeologists have undertaken sophisticated analysis of ancient settlement placement patterns, using statistical methods to determine whether positioning reflects random distribution or intentional selection according to specific principles. Their work suggests that at least some ancient settlement patterns reflect deliberate positioning according to principles we don't fully understand. The statistical analysis makes coincidence increasingly implausible as settlement positioning becomes more consistent across regions and time periods. Some researchers have combined multiple approaches, attempting to integrate geophysical, archaeological, and consciousness research into comprehensive frameworks. This integrative work remains preliminary. It challenges conventional disciplinary boundaries, yet it demonstrates the possibility of interdisciplinary investigation of complex phenomena that doesn't fit neatly into existing academic categories. The research community investigating ley lines remains small compared to mainstream archaeology or geophysics. It faces funding challenges, publication barriers, and professional skepticism. Yet it persists because the researchers are convinced that something significant is occurring. The evidence, while not conclusive by highest scientific standards, is sufficient to justify continued investigation. What's remarkable is the diversity of independent researchers pursuing this investigation. Geophysicists investigating electromagnetic anomalies, archaeologists analyzing settlement patterns, historians examining ancient texts, consciousness researchers studying visitor experiences, architects and urban planners experimenting with applying ley line principles to contemporary design. These researchers often operate independently, unaware of each other's work. Yet their conclusions converge. Different methodologies, different perspectives, different disciplinary approaches, all pointing towards similar conclusions about ley line reality and significance. Amateur researchers and enthusiasts maintain substantial roles in ley line investigation. While amateur research faces obvious limitations and quality control issues, enthusiasts have contributed valuable observations and maintained investigation during periods of academic neglect. Their practical knowledge, experience visiting sites, familiarity with local histories, connections with communities, maintaining traditional knowledge complements academic research. The most productive investigation likely requires closer collaboration between professional researchers and informed enthusiasts, combining academic rigor with practical knowledge from experienced investigators. What's clear is that investigation continues despite institutional barriers. The questions remain compelling, the evidence remains suggestive. Researchers continue following the evidence where it leads, driven by curiosity and conviction that understanding ley lines holds genuine significance. This work, occurring at the margins of mainstream academia, represents the frontier of ley line investigation, the edge where new understanding is gradually emerging despite institutional resistance. Throughout this investigation, we've encountered not merely one mystery, but nested mysteries, questions within questions, each answer generating new inquiries. We've explored evidence for ley line existence and presented frameworks for understanding their origin and function. Yet fundamental questions remain unanswered. This persistence of mystery isn't failure of investigation, it's recognition of genuine complexity. First, the mechanism question. Even if ley lines exist, and ancient peoples deliberately positioned settlements according to ley line principles, we still don't fully understand what ley lines fundamentally are. Are they primarily astronomical projections, artifacts of how celestial bodies appear from different terrestrial positions? Are they geological phenomena, markers of subsurface structures or electromagnetic anomalies? Are they mathematical abstractions, purely geometric patterns without direct physical referent? Are they something that doesn't fit neatly into our current conceptual categories? Different explanations might all be simultaneously true. Ley lines might represent convergence of multiple phenomena operating through different mechanisms. Our inability to identify a single cause might reflect the poverty of our frameworks, rather than the non-existence of ley lines. The phenomenon might resist reduction to single mechanisms precisely because it emerges from multiple systems interacting. Second, the intentionality question. Did ancient peoples deliberately create ley lines, or did they simply recognize and mark patterns that already existed? If they recognized existing patterns, what drew their attention to these specific patterns rather than infinite others? This raises profound questions about perception, intention, and how humans interact with natural patterns. Were ley lines created through human action or discovered through careful observation? Perhaps this distinction itself is misleading. Perhaps the act of marking ley line locations transformed them from mere geometric abstractions to meaningful places in human consciousness and settlement practice. Third, the transmission question. How did knowledge of ley lines spread across cultures, separated by vast distances and centuries of time? Were there direct contacts between distant civilizations, enabling knowledge transmission? Or did different cultures independently discover similar principles? If independent discovery, what does this tell us about human perception and knowledge systems? If cultural transmission, what were the mechanisms? Where are the archaeological traces of contact? Fourth, the function question. We've explored practical applications of ley line knowledge, agricultural optimization, water access, structural integrity. But were these primary reasons ancient peoples engaged with ley lines? Or were ley lines primarily spiritual or cosmological in significance, with practical benefits as secondary consequences? Or does this distinction between practical and spiritual even validly apply to ancient mindsets that might have operated with fundamentally different conceptual categories? Fifth, the persistence question. Why do ley line effects seem to persist across centuries despite astronomical changes? If ley lines were primarily astronomical in origin, shouldn't their significance fade as celestial positions shifted through precession? The fact that they seem to maintain significance suggests something more fundamental than astronomical alignment alone. Sixth, the universality question. Why do similar principles appear across cultures that couldn't have contacted each other? Does this reflect universal human perception of natural patterns? Or does it suggest some other mechanism for knowledge transmission we haven't identified? Seventh, the activation question. Are ley line effects always present, or do they activate under certain conditions? Do they vary seasonally? Are they stronger at particular times? Do certain human activities amplify or diminish their effects? These questions aren't obstacles to overcome. They're genuine mysteries, aspects of reality that resist simple explanation. Engaging with them seriously requires intellectual humility about how much we've forgotten and how much we don't understand about Earth and human consciousness. Modern civilization has grown uncomfortable with mystery. We expect that sufficient investigation will yield answers. We assume that given enough time and resources, all phenomena can be explained and integrated into coherent understanding. Yet the investigation of ley lines suggests something different. Some mysteries might resist complete resolution, not because investigation is insufficient, but because the phenomena themselves might transcend our current conceptual frameworks. Learning to live thoughtfully with such mystery represents a form of wisdom we've largely abandoned. Indigenous cultures worldwide have maintained sophisticated frameworks for coexisting with genuine mystery. Rather than viewing the unknown as a problem to solve, they often treat mystery as an essential dimension of reality, something to engage with respectfully, to learn from. to incorporate into meaning-making without requiring complete comprehension. This represents an alternative epistemology to modern scientific reductionism. It doesn't reject science, but integrates it within broader frameworks, acknowledging mystery's validity. The section will examine how different cultures have approached ley lines and sacred geography, not as problems demanding solution, but as realities inviting participation and reverence. This represents different thinking about knowledge itself. Western science assumes that knowledge consists of reducing phenomena to underlying mechanisms. Understanding means breaking complex wholes into simpler components and explaining relationships. This approach has generated remarkable technological and theoretical achievements, yet it contains blind spots. Some aspects of reality might be understood more deeply through participation and engagement than through analytical reduction. Investigation of ley lines actually deepens rather than resolves mystery. The more we learn about ancient geometric and astronomical sophistication, the more mysterious it becomes that such knowledge could be lost so completely. The more we discover about Earth's geometric and electromagnetic properties, the more mysterious becomes how ancient peoples perceived these properties. The more we understand about consciousness, the more mysterious becomes the relationship between mind and geography. This deepening of mystery represents progress, not failure of investigation, but its success. True investigation doesn't eliminate mystery. It transforms our relationship to mystery by revealing its complexity and significance. We begin recognizing that mystery isn't absence of knowledge, but presence of something our current frameworks can't adequately address. Living with mystery means several things simultaneously. Continuing investigation with rigor and care. Maintaining openness to evidence and new frameworks. Respecting the experiences and knowledge of others. Acknowledging the limits of current understanding. Finding meaning in the process of seeking rather than solely in definitive answers. This represents maturity of engagement, sophistication beyond both naive acceptance and cynical dismissal. Contemporary psychological and spiritual seeking illuminates this principle. Millions of people visit sacred sites, seek out ley line intersections, and report profound experiences at locations ancient peoples marked as significant. This seeking itself is meaningful regardless of whether we can scientifically explain what occurs at these sites. The experiences are real. Their reality doesn't depend on our ability to reduce them to measurable mechanisms. The investigation of ley lines invites us toward this mature engagement with mystery, not closure, but opening, not answers, but better questions, not certainty, but genuine exploration, conducted with intellectual rigor and psychological authenticity. This represents a path forward that honors both scientific investigation and the legitimate human need for meaning beyond mechanistic explanation. The investigation of ley lines carries implications extending far beyond the specific question of ancient site alignment. Understanding these implications requires stepping back from the details and considering what ley line research suggests about human potential, knowledge systems, and our relationship to Earth itself. First, implications regarding ancient capability. Evidence of ley line knowledge suggests ancient peoples possessed sophistication we've systematically underestimated. They understood their world with depth and precision we're only now beginning to appreciate. This challenges narratives of inevitable human progress and suggests that advancement isn't linear. Earlier peoples might have possessed knowledge we've genuinely lost. This realization invites humility about our own assumptions. Second, implications regarding knowledge systems. Discovery that multiple cultures independently arrived at similar principles regarding sacred geometry, astronomical alignment, and optimal settlement positioning suggests universal truths about human flourishing. These truths are accessible through careful observation and reflection, rather than requiring specialized modern technology. Legitimate knowledge can be generated through diverse methodologies, not solely formal scientific approaches. This validates knowledge systems we've dismissed as primitive or superstitious. Third, implications regarding Earth itself. Recognition that ley lines represent genuine phenomena, whether primarily geological, electromagnetic, astronomical, or something else, suggests Earth possesses properties and patterns we've only partially understood. This invites humility about our knowledge of our own planet. Ancient peoples might have perceived aspects of Earth's reality that we've become unable to perceive. The planet itself is more complex and more meaningful than modern materialism acknowledges. Fourth, implications regarding consciousness. If ancient peoples could perceive and respond to ley-line phenomena, human consciousness possesses capabilities we've allowed to atrophy. The potential to develop refined sensitivity to Earth's properties, to perceive subtle electromagnetic variations, to read environmental patterns, represents possibility for human development we might recover. This suggests consciousness isn't static but developable through practice and intention. Fifth, implications regarding civilization. If ley-line knowledge contributed to longevity and flourishing of ancient civilizations, recovering such knowledge might benefit contemporary civilization. Deliberately positioning settlements according to principles aligned with Earth's geometry, rather than purely economic logic, might enhance quality of life, cultural vitality, and resilience. We might discover that Earth has wisdom about optimal human settlement that we've ignored in pursuit of economic efficiency. Sixth, implications regarding environmental relationship. Recognition that ancient peoples deliberately positioned settlements in harmony with natural phenomena suggests alternative models for human civilization, one integrated with Earth rather than imposed against it. This has profound implications for contemporary environmental challenges. Rather than treating Earth as resource to exploit, we might treat it as partner to work with. Rather than imposing our will on geography, we might learn to read geography's own logic and position ourselves accordingly. Seventh, implications regarding spiritual and meaning systems. The investigation of ley lines suggests that spirituality isn't mere fantasy or wishful thinking. Genuine places exist where human experience deepens, where consciousness shifts, where meaning emerges. The spiritual dimension of human experience correlates with physical geography. Sacred sites aren't arbitrary. They're located at places with measurable characteristics. This validates the spiritual seeking that persists across cultures and centuries. Investigating ley lines is ultimately investigating ourselves, our past, our potential, our relationship to the planet we inhabit. It's asking what kind of civilization we might create if we learned from ancient wisdom, what we might become if we recovered capabilities we've allowed to diminish, what Earth might reveal if we developed sensitivity to its patterns. These investigations matter not because ley lines represent mystical forces, but because they represent genuine knowledge about how humans can flourish in genuine harmony with Earth itself. Over the course of this investigation, we've traveled from observation to theory, from skepticism to engagement with genuine mystery. We've encountered evidence, explored frameworks, and acknowledged what remains unknown. This section synthesizes what we've discovered while maintaining appropriate epistemic care, carefully distinguishing between established findings, credible hypotheses, and speculations requiring further investigation. What we know with reasonable confidence. Ley lines as alignments exist. Ancient sites demonstrably align in ways exceeding chance probability. These alignments span continents and cultures. Modern GPS and satellite data confirm what Watkins observed over a century ago. The alignments are real, they're precise, they're extensive. Ancient peoples possessed sophisticated knowledge. The evidence is undeniable. Egyptian priests understood celestial mechanics. Mayan mathematicians predicted eclipses. Vedic scholars described astronomical concepts with accuracy. Aboriginal Australians maintained complex geographical knowledge. Ancient architects positioned monuments with precision and intentionality. This knowledge was systematic, organized, and maintained across generations. The correlation between ley line sites and civilizational success exists and appears consistent. Civilizations positioned at ley line intersections often demonstrated agricultural productivity, intellectual achievement, and cultural longevity exceeding their neighbors. This correlation might reflect multiple factors: better access to water, more stable geology, geomagnetic conditions favorable to life. But the pattern appears genuine and worth serious consideration. Psychological and experiential effects occur at ley line sites. Visitors report consistent experiences across different sites and cultures. These experiences might reflect psychological expectation, but their consistency suggests something more. Whether the effects reflect measurable environmental phenomena or represent genuine mysteries of consciousness. The experiences themselves are real. Institutional barriers impede leyline investigation. Despite technological capability to investigate leyline hypotheses systematically, such investigation remains limited. This represents failure of academic institutions to pursue significant questions, rather than failure of leyline hypotheses to merit investigation. What remains genuinely unknown? The fundamental nature of leylines defies single-cause explanation. Whether they represent primarily astronomical, geological, electromagnetic, or other phenomena remains unclear. Different leylines might represent different phenomena. How ancient peoples perceived leylines remains undetermined. Whether they used conscious techniques, possessed refined sensitivities, or operated through intuitive knowledge remains open. How knowledge was transmitted across cultures remains contested. Whether direct contact occurred, or cultures independently discovered similar principles, remains unresolved. What specific practical benefits leyline positioning conferred remains difficult to isolate. We know civilizations at leyline sites thrived, but separating positioning benefits from other factors requires more comprehensive investigation. What leylines mean for human consciousness and future civilization remains speculative. The section emphasizes that distinguishing known from unknown represents not discouragement, but clarity. Understanding where investigation stands allows more targeted future research. Acknowledging mystery prevents premature closure on genuine questions. This investigation into leylines ultimately represents an invitation to reconsider our relationship to Earth, to ancient wisdom, and to the possibilities of human knowledge and consciousness. For those encountering leyline concepts for the first time, the evidence might seem provocative, the implications radical. For those who've long sensed that conventional narratives about ancient peoples and Earth's properties were incomplete, this investigation offers framework for understanding and exploring intuitions. The invitation operates on multiple levels. First, invitation to curiosity. Leylines represent a genuine mystery, not a problem solved or a conspiracy confirmed, but a genuine mystery inviting continued investigation. We encourage you to maintain curiosity. Visit leyline sites and form your own experiences. Investigate further. The invitation isn't to accept particular theories, but to engage thoughtfully with genuine questions. Second, invitation to respect for ancient knowledge. Ancient peoples possessed sophisticated understanding. Rather than dismissing their cultures as primitive, we might approach them with greater respect and humility. Indigenous traditions worldwide maintain knowledge about sacred geography, optimal settlement positioning, and living in harmony with natural patterns. This knowledge represents hard-won wisdom accumulated through centuries of careful observation. Third, invitation to recover lost capabilities. If ancient peoples could perceive leyline phenomena, human consciousness possesses latent capabilities we might recover through practice and attention. Meditation, sensory awareness training, and careful observation of natural patterns might reconnect us with capabilities we've allowed to atrophy. This isn't mystical, but rather reclaiming natural human potentiality. Fourth, invitation to rethink civilization. If ancient cities positioned according to leyline principles demonstrated greater longevity and flourishing, this suggests alternative possibilities for how contemporary civilization might be organized. Rather than positioning cities according purely to economic logic, we might consider principles enhancing human flourishing and environmental integration. Fifth, invitation to investigation. Perhaps most importantly, this investigation represents an invitation to continued research and exploration. We don't claim to have solved the leyline mystery. We've mapped its territory and identified significant questions. Genuine advancement will require continued investigation by scientists, historians, archaeologists, and engaged seekers willing to pursue evidence wherever it leads. Each person encountering leyline evidence must decide individually whether to engage or dismiss, whether to investigate or maintain skepticism. There's no obligation to accept any particular interpretation. There's an invitation to maintain genuine openness, to honor the questions and evidence supporting them, to participate in ongoing investigation. The practical and psychological challenges of engaging with leyline knowledge in contemporary context shouldn't be minimized. Modern civilization doesn't easily accommodate paradigms challenging its foundational assumptions about ancient peoples, Earth's nature, and human consciousness. Engaging seriously with ley lines requires questioning assumptions about progress, civilization, and sufficiency of current understanding. Yet this challenging of assumptions isn't destructive but potentially liberating, opening space for new possibilities and ways of understanding. It invites us toward greater authenticity in our relationship to knowledge, to Earth, and to human potential. We began this investigation with a straightforward question: why were ancient cities built on ley lines no one can explain today? As we've journeyed through evidence, theories, and mysteries, that question has transformed. We haven't answered it definitively. Rather, we've deepened it, expanded it, recognized it as one facet of a much larger mystery. The question now isn't simply, why did ancient peoples position cities on ley lines, but rather a constellation of interconnected questions. What is Earth, really? What did ancient peoples understand about it that we've forgotten? What is human consciousness capable of perceiving? How should civilization be organized if we recovered ancient wisdom? What knowledge systems exist beyond the scientific paradigm we've privileged? What might we become if we learned to listen, as ancient peoples apparently did, to what Earth itself was communicating through its geometry, its electromagnetic properties, its sacred sites? The investigation of ley lines has opened genuinely profound questions about reality, knowledge, and human potential. The deeper we investigate, the more we recognize how much remains unknown. Not unknown in the sense of awaiting discovery, but unknown in the sense of potentially transcending our current conceptual frameworks altogether. This realization is humbling. It invites epistemic humility. It suggests that wisdom might involve developing comfort with ambiguity, rather than insisting on definitive answers. Ancient peoples seem to understand this principle. They positioned their cities at locations holding mystery, at sites offering something beyond mere practical advantage. They built temples not necessarily to extract information or resources from these locations, but to mark them, to acknowledge their significance, to participate in the mystery itself. This represents a form of wisdom, creating meaning through engagement with mystery, rather than through conquest of the unknown. The contemporary approach of relentlessly seeking to explain and control everything might represent a diminishment of this wisdom. Perhaps what civilization most needs isn't another answer, but permission to engage seriously with genuine mysteries, to investigate without requiring immediate resolution, to respect knowledge systems we don't fully understand, to develop comfort with ambiguity. Returning to the image of ancient peoples, night after night watching stars move, marking seasons' shifts, positioning cities with extraordinary intentionality visible in their actions, is profound respect for their world. Recognition that Earth contained principles worth understanding, patterns worth honoring, mysteries worth preserving. In investigating ley lines, we're investigating whether we might recover that respect. For Earth, for ancient wisdom, for mystery itself. The question that began as, why did they build here, has become, what might we become if we remembered what they knew? Standing at a ley line intersection today, whether physically or through imagination, we might sense echoes of that ancient understanding. The sites persist, the alignments remain, the mystery endures. The investigation continues, not toward definitive conclusion but toward deeper engagement, with questions that might not have final answers, but that lead us toward genuine understanding of ourselves, our planet, and the possibilities of human knowledge and consciousness. This is where the investigation stands, not concluded but continuing. The ley lines remain, patient and eternal, waiting for us to develop sensitivity enough to read what they're communicating. That development, that reawakening of ancient capability and wisdom, might represent the most important journey humanity could undertake.